Hey guys, I am recording this video on Thursday. So if you notice I have the same clothes on and I'm in the same exact spot from yesterday's video, that's why. But I am not going to be available for this class because I am going to be at the funeral for my grandfather. However, Miss Stockdale for third and fourth period, Miss Stockdale and Miss Newton should be available through the Google Meet and Go Guardian. So if you need help, please go to them and they can help you out there. And then as far as fifth and sixth period goes, please reach out and email me if you have questions. I don't think you should. It would be pretty straightforward as far as you're taking notes and working on No Red Ink. And if you have questions, I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. I know that Miss Benjamin would be available as well. And we might have someone in the Google Meet for you tomorrow. If you do have questions, you can check there. But I think you'll be okay with what we have lined up here today. And this is assuming that we have a snow day tomorrow, and considering what the roads look like, I'm assuming you're working from home. All right, so let's talk about what we're doing today. Number one, make sure you've finished all the other assignments from this week. So the Revolution project entry document, the pre-assessment journal response for Revolutions, the Revolution and reading terms ChemChart that we worked on yesterday. And today you're going to do a note-taking workshop and take notes on this. So at home, you are getting out a piece of paper and pencil, or you're, pausing the video and typing notes. However you decide to take notes, you're doing so that way. And this is Russia Before Revolution Google slide, which I'll make sure to link right now. All right, I've got that link now, so we're if you want to click on that, or you can follow through with the video as I'm showing it, presenting it. And then when we're done with that, you will continue working on No Red Ink with the rest of the class period, kind of making a goal to say, get one or two of those practices done, and we'll keep going. So let's take a look at this workshop. And again, pause the video if I'm going too fast. Okay, so that's a great thing about the video is you can pause as you want. You can pause on each slide. Okay, as we begin to talk about this. Okay, all right. So let's take a look here. Okay, click on that should take us to the PowerPoint here. See here, I'm not sure. Yeah, that'll work good. All right, so in this we are talking about Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution. Okay, so we can kind of set the groundwork. And to remember what we're talking about in this project is we are focusing on why people revolt. Okay, that's kind of our driving question, if you will. Why would a people want to revolt against a government, and what happens after that revolt? How does that work? What happens? How does it continue on? So Russia before Revolution. If we look at this image that I pulled up here, this is a painting of the winter before the Bolshevik Revolution, and you can see their theories are this massive people, and they're standing in the snow, and they clearly look very frustrated and upset and broken down. We're going to find out why that is, and it's kind of fitting to have snow outside and kind of feel that cold, like a Russian cold almost, as we are working on this. All right, so our objectives here is describe major obstacles to the progress in Russia and the needs for reform, and then to explain how the czars followed a cycle of totalitarianism, tyranny, reform, and reaction. Now, from your ChemChart, you should be knowing these terms, like czar means like the ruler of the monarch or ruler of Russia. Okay, it's like king or emperor. Okay, czar. It's not tsars, it's czar. The T is silent. Okay, and this also can be spelled with the C instead of the TS. Okay, and then totalitarianism and tyranny means one person has all the control in every aspect of life. Okay, and then reform means change, and reaction is how they react to that change. So, number one thing you need to know is industrialization was very slow, okay, in Russia. More so slow than Western Europe, okay? So we're talking about the late 1800s and the early 1900s of Russia at this time, okay? So we were, last project, we were looking at the Enlightenment. We talked about the Enlightenment in Europe and how it was affecting North America and the United States, and that brought us up through the 1800s. And now we're looking at the Industrial Revolution, industrialization of the world, and Russia is behind them in the mid to late 1800s, okay, versus Western Europe and North America, okay. So we're over in Asia, we're in Russia, and we're looking at their slow reform and change. So efforts to modify Russia had little success because the czars would imprison people that went against them. Okay, so part of the reason that other nations were able to progress is because they had people challenging, like through the Enlightenment to the Scientific Revolution, challenging ideas. And as they challenged ideas, they were able to change and make their society better. But czars would imprison or exile, which exile means to kick out people who were critics of how they were running the country. Okay, so they had this major power and this ability to rule over the people, and they challenged how they had run their government or how they ran the economy or anything like that. They could exile them and throw them out of the country and put them in gulag, which is like a labor camp. So as the 20th century dawned, Russia was a hotbed of civil unrest, which basically meant there were a lot of people upset with how the government was running and the fact that they were way behind the rest of the world. So how this worked out is that, and remember, pause if I'm going too fast, the czars, the emperors, the leaders, the kings, ruled over Russia as totalitarians and absolute power. Whenever the czars made liberal reforms, and liberal reforms, we're not necessarily talking about liberal as in like the Democratic Party, the left, but liberal in more the fact that they were giving more freedoms, liberties. So they were giving more freedoms, liberal reforms. They eventually canceled them to maintain the support of the nobles. So as they gave the people more power, they would just go back on it because the nobles or the people that had the power didn't like that. So there was a lot of give and take. They give them some freedoms. For example, they gave them the freedom to elect representatives, and then they took it away because the representatives had like no power at all. Okay, the representatives, they had like a council or representatives, a government, but that government had zero to no power, and they just take it away from them. So while the governments in other European nations changed, being more democratic, like through the Enlightenment, having more opportunities for representation and more rights for their citizens, Russia remained an absolute monarch, okay, into the 1900s, okay, and continued to rule with a totalitarian government, people having very little to no power. All right, so let's look at our first totalitarian, our first czar, and that is Alexander II. Okay, Alexander II. So he ruled from 1861 to 1871. Okay, he would emancipate the serfs. The serfs were the common people that were tied into forced labor because they didn't own land and they were basically forced into this lifestyle. He emancipated them, giving them their freedoms. He established local governments in the form of elected assemblies, like we talked about a second ago, and he gave legal reforms such as trial by jury and reduction of military service. So you don't have to memorize all these things. The big idea here is that he freed the serfs and he gave them local government, okay? And then he gave them some small like trial by jury and reduction in forced military service, because in Russia at the time, all men were forced into military service. So Alexander II gave some of the common people a little bit of power, some freedoms, gave them more rights through like trial and things like that. However, the reforms didn't satisfy the Russians, okay, because it really didn't lead to any change. And what they wanted was to see the changes that were happening in the United States and the changes that were in, because, you know, by this time in the 1860s, the United States is 100 years old, and we're seeing revolutions in France and Great Britain and all over the place in Europe. And they wanted changes like a constitution, okay, that were going to guarantee them their rights, or more revolutionary changes in like something like freedom of speech and freedom of petition and more power for the elected class. So socialists tried to convince peasants to rebel. So socialism is this idea that everyone deserves equal opportunity, equal goods, and equal monetary value in the economic system. Well, that was on our Chem chart as well. But they tried, these socialists who wanted this equal distribution, tried to convince peasants to rebel, which didn't work, and the radicals became angry, and these radical socialists assassinated the Tsar, Alexander II, in 1881. So they assassinated him, okay, killing the Tsar because they weren't able to get a revolution together at this time. So Alexander III, who is Alexander II's son, will take the throne and embark on a crackdown because these radicals murdered his father, and now he is the totalitarian Tsar, the person with power. So he is going to increase powers of the secret police and exile critics. And basically, there's kind of this reign of terror under Alexander III as he takes power. So let's talk about Alexander III. And we're getting into the part of our class where we're going to see some really intense beards and mustaches. So a lot of students think it's really fun to kind of look at all of these like eccentric beards and mustaches, which honestly is in an interesting way are coming back around in fashion. Like we see a lot of people growing beards. Matter of fact, my beard is growing back. It is not as lush and beautiful as our Alexander III's, but maybe I'll get there eventually. Just joking. But Tsar Alexander III ruled from 1881 to 1894. Okay, he would use gulags to punish anyone that went against his rule. Okay, he also persecuted Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Armenians, Finns. So these groups are groups that are part of Russia as a larger whole and didn't align with what their national views. He also inflicted punishment on Muslims, basically anyone that did not involve his nationalistic view of how the nation should be run and be grouped together. He was very strict and very hard against them, causing many to die and be punished. His son would come to rule, Tsar Nicholas II, and he would take power over Russia in 1896. Again, very ornate, large. I mean, this mustache comes out past his face. Okay, so lots of interesting beards and mustaches here. But Nicholas II would establish a Duma, which a Duma is an elected legislative representative of the people within a government. So this is a kind of like the legislative branch of Russia in 1906 to appease the people. So he would kind of slow down and step back and allow for more power. But again, all this is with these czars is they give a little bit and then they take it away. They give a little bit, they take it away. They give a little bit and take it away. And this has been happening for hundreds of years. And we see this again through Alexander II, Alexander III, and now Nicholas II. But Nicholas II will be the last czar of Russia. Despite talks of reform, Tsar Nicholas did little to solve Russia's problems. Okay? Main issues that we have going on. These three things. You need to know this. Rulers lived in luxury while their people lived in poverty. Okay? Rulers had extreme wealth, ornate castles and buildings and palaces, well-fed nice, wonderful luxury homes and lives, okay? While the people lived in very rough, very hard situations, okay? Corruption was rampant, okay? Basically, whoever had power, whoever had the money, whoever had pull, life went their way. Corruption throughout. And the Duma, the legislative branch that Tsar Nicholas II had started, had no real power, no real status. So, in 1914, World War I united many of the Russians. So, we will have World War I coming about in 1914. But the war strained the country's mismanaged resources. Now, remember, we said Russia was behind the rest of the world as far as industrialization goes, okay? So with them being so far behind, entering into World War I, which we haven't talked about World War I yet, but we'll talk about that next project. One thing you need to know is that it called on all the resources of these countries. And Russia being behind, they're going to have a lot of trouble in World War I. So factories couldn't produce enough military supplies, the transportation system couldn't deliver food to the battlefields, and many soldiers had no guns and no ammunitions. Millions of soldiers would die. Now, this is key that they had no guns, okay, no ammunition to fight. We're going to talk about that in a second with Tsar Nicholas II. So Russians lost confidence in their government, okay? Tsar Nicholas would travel to the front line, so the Tsar would go to the front line, but they would find out he was a very poor military leader, okay? He had a lot of issues with leading his men and had a lot of unsuccessful ventures. And one thing, going back to the last slide, them not having guns, there are stories told in history has been written on this, that Tsar Nicholas and the leaders of the Russians would, at the end of the war, have their men lined up because they were so short on ammunition and weapons. They would basically team a group together, and a group of men would have one weapon. Okay, and if basically your job was to follow that person that had a weapon and stay with them until they died. And when they died, you would pick up their weapon and continue to fight. I can't imagine, and if you take a second to pause and think about that, how horrible and demoralizing that would be to know you're going into battle and basically you can't fight or can't do anything until the person that is on your team and on your side and working with you dies, and then you pick up their weapon and continue to fight. You can see that this is the beginning of the end for the Tsar and their power. And one of the reasons that they go into this fight. So, Tsarina, which is the female, it's like empress or queen, Tsarina Alexandra, ignored the continued food and fuel shortages at home. So while they were suffering at the battlefield, at home, the people were starving and they were freezing to death. Okay, so in March in Russia, it's very cold still. It's still cold here, but it's very cold there. And in March in 1917, workers went on strike. Okay, so workers stopped working because they were starving and freezing to death. And the people filled the streets chanting for bread. So we go back to that first picture at the very beginning of this. That is the image that we're seeing. They're in the streets. They're freezing. They're striking. If you notice, this guy is kind of ripping open, showing his chest and just screaming like, we're starving, we're suffering. And they're chanting bread, bread, bread in the streets. And this is the beginning of the revolution. All right. So with disaster on the battlefield and protest at home, Nicholas will abdicate. Now, this will come after long strikes and fighting and millions of deaths on the battlefield. They will actually storm a winter palace where Tsar Nicholas's family is, and there's a lot of stories about this family. We're not going to get into that, but the big idea here is that he will abdicate, and at the end of this, there will be two viewpoints that are left, okay? One side are the Mensheviks, and the other side are the Bolsheviks, okay? Clearly, we call this the Bolshevik Revolution, so obviously the Bolsheviks will be the side that wins out. So, but let's talk about both sides because it's important to know both sides. So the Mensheviks favored gradual reform, okay? After the Tsar advocates, leaves, and gives up his power, the Mensheviks step up and say, we want gradual reform, slow reform. We want some higher wages for workers, increased suffrage, which suffrage means the right to vote, and welfare programs. So they want to make slow change. Now, think about what's happened over the last 100 years in Russia. They were promised these small changes, and then they were just taken back. Small changes, and they were taken back. So do you think the people would go with the Mensheviks? No. People are going to line with the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks wanted radical change. They wanted a total revolution, a complete change in what was happening in Russia. Okay? So let's take a moment and look back at why this happened and how it happened and kind of the reasons for revolt. So there's a lot of information on this page. Let's take it and break it down. Okay. So summarize reasons for revolt. So one of the things we're wanting to know is, why did the people of Russia revolt? Number one, repeated actions by the Russian czars followed to allow liberal change and then to go back on their word and return to totalitarianism. So the big idea here is no real change. The government kept promising that they protect the people, and they failed to do so. Number two, corruption of the noble class. Okay, so corruption, collecting taxes and living in luxury while the majority of the people lived in poverty. Number three, the Duma was given no real power. The representative class had no real power. Number four, repeated violations of human rights and freedoms, being sent to labor camps, being spied on, no right to revolt or no right to petition, no right of freedom of speech, missing these human rights. And then the breaking point. Millions of Russians were freezing and starving to death in Russia in 1917. Russia was facing devastating loss of life in World War I, and they were chanting and wanting land, peace, or bread and peace. So all of these things together, okay, will lead to a breaking point in which the Russians will revolt and the Tsar will give up his power. Again, if I'm going too quick, pause and make sure you get all this. So on the other side of that, the Bolsheviks will take the lead and will win kind of the leadership of the revolution, and they would be led by Vladimir Lenin, V.I. Lenin. Lenin is what you need to remember. He was a Marxist who urged workers to unite and overthrow capitalism. Okay, so Lenin believed that the capitalistic regime and this capitalistic economic system that the totalitarians were using, and arguments on whether it was true capitalism, but this idea that capitalism, and we looked at capitalism, and that is free trade where the markets have freedom and there's individual ownership. So they viewed these totalitarians as owning all the private goods, and that actually should be owned by all of the people. And we're going to look at what communism and what Marxism is later, and we'll talk about that in a second. But he called for the unity among workers and farmers, so for the common people to unite together, and then he would promise peace, land, and bread, which is directly coming from why there was a revolution. Okay, they wanted to end the war in World War I because they were still at this time they're still in the war. They wanted to end the war. They wanted the people to own the land because they didn't want to be servants to the czars or any of the nobles who owned all the land. And then they wanted food because they were starving to death. Okay, so peace, land, and bread. So Lenin aligned with Marxism. Now, Karl Marx, who came up with Marxism, was not Russian. Okay, he was not from the Soviet Union. He was not Russian, although the Soviet Union would be the first real communist power. he was not Russian, and that is a common misconception. Also lived well before this time. Okay, he was a German philosopher, and he supported the establishment of socialism and communism. Okay, he wrote the Manifesto of the Communist Party along with Frederick Engels. Okay, the Communist Manifesto. Okay, is what it's popularly called. He was unhappy with capitalism and the negative aspects of industrialization. Most significantly, the unfair exploitation of the working class. So in Germany, Karl Marx, through the 1800s, witnessed the industrialization and felt that it was unfair that through capitalism, the people who owned the means of production, the few people that owned it, gained all the wealth while the workers got very little part of that wealth. And he didn't like that. So he came up with this idea. So socialism, according to Marx, okay, he believed that a select few in society controlled most of the wealth and were taking advantage of the working class, okay? So he believed, this is capitalism. Sorry, it should be say capitalism according to Marx. He believed that capitalism, so this, you can see this image over here. It says pyramid of capitalist system. All the workers are on the bottom getting crushed by the rich, the military, the church, and the leaders, okay? And all the workers, the majority of the people, are being crushed by all of these people that owned everything and had the wealth, the nobles, the military, the church, and the people in power. And he believed there were two classes within this system of capitalism. First was the bourgeoisie, okay? Practice that word a few times. It's French, bourgeoisie. And if you've ever heard anyone use the word that's bougie, this is what it comes from. Bourgeoisie. That's bougie, bourgeoisie. And those are the people who own the means of production and were considered the wealthy class of capitalists. Okay. So that would be this higher rung of people that are crushing the working class, in his opinion. The other side of this was the proletariat, the working class, or lower class in the capitalist society, okay? So this was the working class, the proletariat, the workers. Originally, this was a derogatory term in nature, and Marx used the term to describe the working class. So this is the people that trudged along and worked, and in his opinion, the bourgeoisie took advantage of. And what needed to take place to fix this? This is our last slide. In his opinion, Marx believed that history could be explained through class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The workers had to unite and overthrow this capitalistic rulers, okay, this capitalistic idea. And he was convinced that history would pass through certain phases of feudalism, and then capitalism, and then socialism, until finally a communist society would emerge where all the people lived in this utopia, in this equal society. Okay, and this is what Lenin was standing for and wanted for the people. So we're done with our workshop for now. You all will now make sure you have all those notes. We'll continue talking about this on Monday of next week. And after you have finished this, you should go into and work on your no-reading connecting clauses. Make sure you're good. Otherwise, have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all on Monday. Thank you.